Apple's added lots of camera features to its iPhone 12 Pro Max this year, including a larger sensor shift stabilization, a longer telephoto lens, and 10-bit Dolby Vision HDR video. That sounds pretty amazing. But how does that video compare to a real camera? And not just any camera, but a mirrorless full-frame camera paired with high-quality lenses. And does all that computational photography and video mean that the iPhone can overcome the limitations of a small sensor and beat or at least match a proper camera? Let's find out! Alright, so before we begin, keep in mind that while these videos were shot in 10-bit HDR video, you'll be seeing them in 8-bit SDR just for compatibility's sake. Also on the A7 III, I shot an aperture priority and kept the exposure compensation at 0 EV for this comparison, and shot the daytime shots at f8. So we start with a very high dynamic range scene here. When you see this in Dolby Vision on the iPhone screen, it looks fantastic, but even here I think it's doing a great job. You can see here that the A7 III has actually controlled the highlights pretty well, but shadows are a little bit darker than they should be. Here in the side-by-side comparison, you can see that the shadows are much better exposed on the iPhone, as are the highlights. This is a tough scene for any camera, but I think the iPhone's doing a great job handling it. Unfortunately, the Sony is blowing out the sky and the sun quite a bit, and the shadows are pretty dark. The stabilization is also really good on the iPhone compared to the A7 III. So here we've boosted the shadows to somewhat match the iPhone, and it's holding up pretty well. We've tried to reduce the highlights here to try and match, but you can't really do that and it doesn't hold up at all. You can see so much more detail in the clouds on the iPhone. Here we're comparing the 2.5x lens on the iPhone to the 55mm 1.8 Zeiss lens on the A7 III. I'd say both look pretty good at this 1080p crop. So those 10-bit files from the 12 Pro Max are really nice. You can bring down the highlights and it looks very natural and pleasing to the eye. Here in the super crop we can see a difference, but I'm not sure it'll be noticeable when viewed at normal sizes. This is one of the weaker lenses on the iPhone, and so in a crop you can see the difference from the A7 III. Here's a stabilization test. The iPhone 12 Pro Max is doing a great job. Now you can see here that the A7 III has blown out the faces of these women. While the iPhone is exposing quite bright, it doesn't look blown at all. That's the extended dynamic range of the iPhone doing its thing. So here we've tried to reduce the highlights or bring them back a little bit, but there's again no leeway as it is totally blown on the Sony. However, on the iPhone we are able to reduce the exposure and have it look quite a bit better. Here's a stabilization test on the longer lenses, and the iPhone's doing a fantastic job. The Sony, pretty much unusable in this case. And I think you would probably want to use a gimbal if you're going to walk with it a lot. Stabilization in daytime on all three lenses of the iPhone looks almost gimbal-like. And as a package, it's a lot easier to handle than an A7 III on a gimbal. There is a lot of flaring on all three iPhone lenses. That's something to keep in mind. The lesser dynamic range on the Sony is actually working in its favor here with the dog. There's a nice glow on the dog's fur. Okay, so here we can see quite a bit of difference because of the iPhone 12 doing its extended dynamic range thing where it combines two frames into one. We have great detail in the shadows and in the highlights. So what we're doing is we're going to boost the shadows on the A7 III to match. So when we go into a super crop, we can see here that the Sony, because we boosted the shadows, has more noise. It also retains more detail, although some people might find the iPhone more pleasing with its over-sharpened sort of look. Here we can see on the super crop, the difference in detail is really quite close. Here we're going to boost the shadows again to try and match and see how it looks. These scenes look remarkably similar. And here we can see the great stabilization at work. The iPhone maintains a smooth video. Using the Sony means you sometimes have to choose between exposing for what you want or the sky or certain kinds of highlights. This is the kind of scene that throws off exposure on the Sony, and you kind of have to choose if you want to expose for the shadows or the highlights. So here's a setting with lower light. Can you see a difference between the two images? To my eyes, there is a bit more detail in the Sony image. In general, the Sony tends to underexpose scenes for my liking, and I often have to use the exposure compensation. So as the light drops, the difference expands between the two. And we can see here that noise has crept in. And we can see here that the iPhone's image is starting to look a lot more smudgy because of the noise reduction. And the two cameras choose a drastically different white balance for this shot. In reality, I would say it's somewhere in between the two. However, to my eyes, the Sony is the more pleasing white balance. In this shot, I would say the sky looks great in both images, but the shadows are a bit dark on the Sony, so we're going to boost them and compare. And here I have opened up the aperture on the Sony. Looking in at the crop, it's looking really good and quite a bit more detailed than the iPhone. And in this shot, where it was dark enough, where for photo mode it triggered night mode, you can see that the iPhone has quite a bit more noise and noise reduction applied. Here in the crop you can notice it quite easily on the brick. And in the super crop it's very obvious. However, I'd still say it's doing a great job for a phone. Finally, here we have a shot with pretty extreme examples of dynamic range. The lights on the building are very bright and the Sony appears to be blowing them out, whereas the iPhone has them well controlled. When we boost the shadows on the A7 III, it reveals a lot of detail in the trees and it's a pretty good image overall. While there is some noise in the shadows, I think it's nothing to complain about. When we do the same with the iPhone 12 Pro Max, there's a lot of noise in the shadows, and I wouldn't really consider that usable. Here, side by side, you can see how much difference there is at night. If we try to reduce the highlights on the Sony, we'll find that the result isn't really usable because it is completely blown and can't be recovered, and it doesn't make the image look good at all. Side by side, I really love that extended dynamic range feature that the iPhone has, and I wish that camera manufacturers would start incorporating that kind of technology. That's it for this comparison. Let me know what you thought.